We begin with the state assembly nearing the expected passage of a bill that would ban abortion procedures after 14 weeks of pregnancy. Right now, state law prohibits abortion after 20 weeks. The bill's supporters say closing the window after 14 weeks could save more fetuses from death. If passed into law, the proposal would set up a statewide referendum during April's election, asking voters whether the 14-week prohibition should take effect. If that referendum passes, the ban would take effect after the vote results are certified. If the proposal's approved today in the Assembly, it would go to the Senate, where its prospects are less clear. And Governor Evers is expected to veto the measure. He has said repeatedly he won't sign any bill that restricts reproductive health care.